Roy Mercer grabbed his daughter's wrist before she could reach the door. "You're not going anywhere," he said, and his voice carried no anger, just the flat certainty of a man who had already decided. "Not until I get what you owe me." "I don't owe you anything, Papa." He laughed at that. Actually laughed, like she'd said something foolish. Then he shoved a crumpled bill of sale across the table, her name written at the top in his own handwriting, and told her the auction started at noon. Eliza Mercer was 20 years old. She had never once asked her father for a single thing she hadn't earned, and now he was selling her like a horse. If you've never seen a person stand on a wooden platform while strangers decide what they're worth, count yourself lucky. This story will show you exactly what that looks like, and what one quiet cowboy did about it. If this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now stay with us. This one is worth every minute. The auction block in Red Hollow wasn't much to look at. It was a raised wooden platform outside the feed store, 8 feet wide and maybe 5 feet off the ground, built for selling livestock and occasionally used for estate sales when somebody died owing more than they owned. The wood had gone gray from weather and use, and there were old dark stains on the planks that nobody talked about. On most days, people walked past it without a second glance. On the morning of September the 4th, there was a crowd gathered around it. 3 people deep. Word traveled fast in a town like Red Hollow. The saloon had been buzzing since the night before. Roy Mercer had run up a debt he couldn't cover, and he'd come up with a solution that made even the rougher men in town go quiet when they heard it. Some of them went quiet because they were disgusted. Others went quiet because they were calculating. Eliza stood at the back of Harding's feed store, behind a row of grain sacks, and she pressed her spine against the wall so hard she could feel the wood grain through her dress. Her wrists were not bound. There was no rope. Roy had simply told her what would happen if she ran, and she believed him, because she had believed him her whole life, and because the man standing nearest the door, one of Roy's card-playing friends, a thick-necked man named Cutter, was watching her with his arms crossed and his eyes flat. She was not going to cry. She had decided that at sunrise, when Roy had come into the room where she slept and pulled the blanket off her, and told her to get dressed in something presentable. She had not cried then. She was not going to start now. What she was going to do was think. The problem was that thinking didn't produce much. She had no money. She had no horse. The nearest town with the rail station was 40 miles east, and the 2 women she might have called friends in Red Hollow, Mrs. Alderman and the widow Price, were both out of town for the week visiting family. She had thought about the sheriff, but the sheriff in Red Hollow was a man named Dillard, who owed Roy Mercer 3 favors and collected a small fee for looking the other way when things got complicated. So she stood behind the grain sacks, and she did not cry, and she tried to think, and the clock on the feed store wall ticked toward noon. Roy Mercer stepped outside. Eliza heard the crowd noise shift, the way it does when the person everyone came to see finally appears. She heard her father's voice, easy and familiar, the voice he used when he was selling something. "Gentlemen, thank you all for coming out." She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she straightened her back, pulled her hands away from the wall, and walked toward the door. Cutter stepped sideways to block her. "Move," she said. "Your daddy said—" "I heard what my daddy said." She met his eyes and held them. "I'm going to walk out there on my own. If you put your hands on me, I will bite through your ear, and I am not joking about that." Cutter stared at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside. She walked out into the September sun. The platform was worse up close than she'd imagined it from inside. The boards creaked when she stepped up onto them, and the crowd sound shifted again, lower, more focused, the sound of people turning to look at the same thing at the same time. She kept her chin level. She put her hands at her sides instead of clasped in front of her, which was what she wanted to do, because clasped hands looked like begging, and she was not going to beg. Roy stood to her left, maybe 6 feet away, with a piece of paper in his hand that he was already waving at the crowd like it meant something. He looked exactly like he always looked. She hated that about him, how ordinary he appeared, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, the kind of face that photographed well. People who didn't know him tended to trust him on sight, which was, she supposed, how he'd managed to accumulate and lose 3 different fortunes across 2 decades. Now, As I've explained to some of you, Roy said, projecting to the back of the crowd, this is a straightforward matter of debt settlement. My daughter Eliza here is a hard worker, 20 years old, healthy, knows how to cook, keep house, manage livestock. She got a disposition problem? Somebody shouted from the left side of the crowd, and a few men laughed. She's spirited, Roy said. I'll be honest about that, but spirited can be managed. Eliza looked straight out over the crowd's heads at the mountains in the distance. She focused on the highest peak, which still had snow on it even in September, a faint white line against the blue sky. She kept her breathing even. She did not look at her father. Starting bid is $40, Roy said. $40. Something moved through her chest. Not quite pain, not quite anything she had a name for. She had grown up in this man's house. She had cooked his meals and washed his clothes and nursed him through 2 bad winters. And he had put a number on her, $40. 50, said a voice from the right. 60, said another. It went fast after that. The bidding had a horrible momentum to it, men calling out numbers with the same casual energy they'd use at a livestock auction, pausing to confer with each other, some of them grinning. Eliza kept her eyes on the mountain. She counted the seconds between bids. She breathed. At $120, the field narrowed to 2 men. She knew who they were without looking. She had heard their names when the bids started climbing. Harlan Pride, who owned the largest mine operation east of the ridge, and had a reputation for going through hired help fast enough that people had started making jokes about it. And Benedict Cross, who was 53 years old and had come to Red Hollow 6 months ago from somewhere back east with a great deal of money and almost no personal history that anyone could verify. Both of them frightened her, Pride because of the things she'd heard, Cross because of the way he'd looked at her when she'd walked out onto the platform. Not the way most of the crowd had looked at her, which was bad enough. He'd looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already mentally placed in a room in his house. 140. 160. Roy Mercer was smiling. She hated his smile more than almost anything else about him. It was the smile of a man who had gambled everything and was watching the chips come back in. Easy, satisfied, like none of this was costing him a single thing, because it wasn't. It was costing her everything, and it cost him nothing. That was the arrangement, $180. Pride dropped out with a grunt. Cross stepped forward from the crowd. He was a tall man, well-dressed by Red Hollow standards, with pale eyes and a slight accent that nobody had quite pinned down. He straightened his coat and looked up at Eliza on the platform with that same measuring look. 200, he said, and I'll consider the matter settled. The crowd went quiet. $200 was serious money. Even Roy looked briefly surprised, not displeased, just recalibrating. 200, Roy repeated. Do I hear? 250. The voice came from the back of the crowd. Everyone turned. I was not a remarkable-looking man. That was the first thing Eliza noticed about him, and it stayed with her later because she'd expected someone dramatic. Some hero out of a dime novel, broad and loud and movie handsome. Instead, what she saw was an ordinary-sized man on a good horse, sitting at the edge of the crowd with his hat pushed back and his expression entirely calm. Dusty from the road. A working man's hands visible even from the platform. Maybe 35, maybe older. The kind of face that was hard to age because it had settled into itself without making a fuss about it. He walked his horse forward slowly until he was at the edge of the crowd, and people moved out of his way, not because he demanded it, but because something about his pace made stepping aside feel like the natural thing to do. $250, he said again. His voice was level. Not loud. Just clear. Cross turned to look at him with something shifting behind those pale eyes. I don't know you. No reason you would, the man said. That's a significant sum to throw at something you rode past by accident. I didn't ride past by accident. He looked up at the platform then, directly at Eliza, and the look was completely different from how the other men had looked at her. There was no calculation in it. He just looked at her for a moment like he was establishing a fact, and then he looked back at Cross. 250. You want to go higher? Go ahead. Cross stared at him for a beat. Then he looked at Roy. Who is this man? Roy had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I'm not sure. Silas Boone, the man said. I run cattle up on the North Ridge. I've been in Red Hollow before, just not recently. He reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope. I've got the money here, cash. $250 cash was not something you argued with in Red Hollow or anywhere else in the territory. Cross stared at the envelope for a long moment. His jaw moved. Then he stepped back. "Do I hear 260? Roy called out, with the desperate hopefulness of a man watching his moment start to wobble. Nobody spoke. "Going once," Roy said. "Going twice." "Get on with it," somebody in the crowd muttered. "Sold," Roy said, and he looked at his daughter on the platform with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not guilt, not apology, just completion. Look of a man who had finished a transaction. What happened next was short and without ceremony. Silas Boone dismounted, handed his horse's reins to a boy standing near the feed store steps, walked to where Roy Mercer was standing, and counted out the money. Roy signed the paper he'd been carrying. Silas folded the paper without looking at it and put it in his coat. Eliza came down off the platform. She did not take anyone's hand to do it. She stepped down the 3 wooden stairs at the platform's edge on her own, and she walked across the 10 feet of open ground between the platform and where Silas Boone was standing, and she stopped. She didn't know what she was supposed to say. She was not sure she was supposed to say anything. The crowd was still watching. She could feel it, and she understood that to many of them, this moment was just the end of an entertaining afternoon. The transaction was complete. The entertainment was over. Silas Boone looked at her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a dark greenish gray and that there were lines at the corners of them from a lot of years of looking into the sun. He did not look triumphant. He did not look particularly pleased with himself. He looked, if anything, like a man who had just done something that needed doing and was now thinking about what came next. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The question startled her. She'd been braced for almost anything except that. "No," she said. "You need a minute before we ride, or are you ready to go?" She looked at her father, who was counting the bills again off to the side, not looking at her. She looked at the crowd, which was beginning to break up now that the main event was over. She looked at Benedict Cross, who was walking away with his coat still perfectly straight, his pale eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. "I'm ready," she said. Silas nodded. He walked back to his horse, took the reins from the boy, and flipped him a coin. Then he looked at Eliza. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "There's a spare horse at the livery. I arranged it this morning." He paused. "I can explain everything once we're clear of town. Right now, I'd like to put some distance between us and this place." "That makes 2 of us," Eliza said. Something shifted very briefly in his expression. Not a smile exactly, something quieter than that. They walked toward the livery together, and neither of them looked back. The horse Silas had arranged for her was a solid bay mare with good manners and an easy gait, which Eliza appreciated because her hands were still shaking and she was hoping he couldn't tell. They rode north out of Red Hollow at a steady pace, not rushing, and for the first mile or so, neither of them said anything. She used the silence to settle herself. The shaking in her hands worked itself out after a while. The mountains were ahead of them, closer now, and the air was cooler as they gained elevation and the town fell away behind them. Finally, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "No," Silas agreed. "I mean, you didn't know me. You'd never met me." "That's true." She waited. He didn't continue. After another stretch of silence, she said, "Are you going to explain?" I said I would. He reached into his coat and produced the paper Roy had signed. He held it out to her across the narrow space between their horses. "Take a look at that." She took it. She unfolded it. It was a bill of sale, Roy's handwriting, with her name on it, and written across it in ink that was still slightly damp. Silas must have done it before he handed the envelope over, or sometime during the counting, were 2 words in careful block letters. Void. Free. Below that, a second document, clipped to the first. She unfolded it and read it twice before she trusted what she was seeing. It was a legal declaration signed by a notary in the next town over, dated 2 days ago. It stated that one Eliza Ann Mercer was a free person under territorial law and that no debt, sale, or contractual arrangement entered into by any other party on her behalf could be considered legally binding. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came out differently than she expected. "You had this notarized 2 days ago." 3 days ago, I heard about your father's plan from a man who'd been in his card game," Silas said. "I know the notary in Benton personally. It took a day to ride there and back." "You planned this?" "Yes." She looked at the documents in her hands for a long moment. The paper was good quality, not cheap, and the notary's seal was real. She knew what a real territorial seal looked like because she'd handled enough of her father's legal documents over the years, back when he still had legal documents worth handling. "So you spent $250, she said slowly, "and 3 days of your time, and rode 40 miles round trip to a notary, for a person you'd never met." "When you put it that way, it sounds like I need a reason," Silas said. "You do need a reason." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily. A hawk went over them high up, riding a current of air without working at it. "My mother," he said. "When I was 11. There was a situation, not the same, but something like it. A man who thought he had the right to decide what her life looked like." He paused. "There was nobody in a position to do much about it. That bothered me for a long time." Eliza looked at the side of his face. He was watching the trail ahead, not her. "Did it end badly?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply, and she understood that was all she was going to get on that subject, and she didn't push. She folded the documents carefully and tucked them into the front pocket of her dress, where she could feel them against her ribs. "I don't have any money," she said. "I know. I don't have any place to go. My mother's family is in Ohio, and I haven't had contact with them in 4 years. My father made sure of that." I figured something like that," Silas said. "I'm not—" She paused, choosing the words carefully. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just want you to know the situation clearly. I don't want there to be any confusion about what I have or don't have." He nodded. "The way I see it, you've got a few options. I can take you to Benton. That's a bigger town, more people, more work. Or there's Harlow Springs, further east, near the rail line. Or—" He hesitated for the first time. "I've got a ranch on the North Ridge. It's not big. There's work if you want it, and I pay fair wages. You'd have your own room, your own key." He glanced at her. "I'm saying that because it matters. Your own key means what it means." Eliza studied him for a long moment. He was looking at the trail again. She had spent 20 years learning to read men. It was a skill you developed when you lived with Roy Mercer. You learned to hear what was underneath the words, to feel the shape of what someone actually intended underneath what they said. Some men were dangerous in ways that showed immediately. Some were dangerous in ways that took longer to surface. She could not read Silas Boone as dangerous. She could not read him as dishonest. She could not read him as anything other than exactly what he appeared to be, and that itself was strange enough to make her careful. "I'll think about it," she said. "Take your time," he said. "We've got about 6 hours of riding." They stopped at midday to water the horses at a creek that ran fast and cold out of the rocks above. Eliza climbed down stiffly. She hadn't ridden in several months, and the tension of the morning had settled into her back and shoulders, and walked to the creek and put her hands in the cold water, and held them there. Silas built a small fire and put a pot of coffee on. He did not fuss about it. He did not make conversation. He just built the fire and set the coffee, and then sat back against a rock and looked at the mountains while the water heated. "You're not very talkative," Eliza said, once the coffee was ready and she'd been handed a cup. "People generally think that's a flaw," he said. "I don't. I grew up with a man who talked constantly." He looked at her over the edge of his cup. "Your father. He had a gift for it. He could talk for 20 minutes and not say a single true thing, and you'd walk away feeling like you'd learned something." She drank her coffee. It was strong and slightly bitter and perfect. "I've come to prefer people who don't feel the need to fill up silence." Silas looked back at the mountains. After a moment, he said, "The ranch is called the Boone Spread locally, though I've never called it that myself. It's about 1,200 acres, which sounds like a lot and isn't, up in the high country where half of it is rocky slope. I run about 200 head of cattle. I've got a foreman named Garrett. He's been with me 7 years. And 2 seasonal hands who come through spring and fall." He paused. "The house is old. I've been working on it. The kitchen is decent. The room I'd offer you is on the east side, which means you'd get the morning light if that matters to you." Eliza listened to all of this carefully. "You're trying to make it sound like something I'd want," she said. "I'm trying to describe it accurately," he said. "You can make your own decision about whether you want it." "What would my work look like?" "Cooking, mainly. Housekeeping. Garrett's been managing that too, which isn't fair to him. It's not what he signed up for. If you wanted to help with other things, that could be arranged, but I'm not going to tell you what your work has to be. You'd be an employee, you'd be paid. If it didn't suit you, you'd be free to go anywhere." "And if it didn't suit you?" I'd give you a month's notice and a horse to get there. She looked at him. A month's notice. You'd be entitled to it. That's how it works when you hire somebody. She thought about that. She thought about Benton, which she'd been through once 2 years ago. A busy, mid-sized town with a main street full of people who looked like they were in a hurry, and a boarding house she remembered as smelling like mildew and old soup. She thought about Harlow Springs, which she didn't know at all, which meant starting from nothing in a place where she had no connections and no references. She thought about Benedict Cross walking away from the auction with his coat straight and his pale eyes aimed at something only he could see. "Morning light," she said. Silas looked at her. "The room. You said it gets morning light." "It does." She finished her coffee. "All right," she said. "I'll try the ranch." Something moved across his face, too quick and too quiet to be called relief, but something in that territory. "Good," he said. They reached the base of the North Ridge as the afternoon light started going orange and long, and the trail narrowed enough that they had to ride single file, Silas ahead. The air up here was sharper and smelled of pine and cold rock. The cattle range opened up on the slopes above them, and Eliza could hear the distant sound of cattle moving somewhere higher up, the low, grumbling sound of animals doing animal business, completely indifferent to everything humans were getting up to below them. The ranch buildings came into view around a long bend in the trail. A main house of squared timber and stone, older than it first appeared but solid. A barn that was larger than the house and in better repair. 3 smaller outbuildings. A well with a proper stone surround. And a corral attached to the south side of the barn where 3 horses stood in the late sun, tails swishing. It was not pretty in the way that some places were pretty. It did not have flower boxes or a painted gate or any of the small domestic signals that people put up to tell the world they had made something nice. But it had the look of a place that worked, everything where it needed to be, nothing wasted, no falling down fence posts or piles of rotting lumber that hadn't been dealt with. A serious place built by serious people for serious purposes. A man came out of the barn when they rode in. He was broad and dark-haired, probably 45, with the kind of walk that said he'd been working hard physical labor his whole adult life and had stopped noticing it. "Garrett," Silas said. Garrett looked at Eliza with frank curiosity and then looked back at Silas. "She'll be staying," Silas said. "She's hired on as housekeeper. Her name is Eliza Mercer. She's got the East Room." Garrett's expression shifted through something complicated. Surprise? Questions he was deciding not to ask, a general recalibration, and then settled into something that wasn't exactly warm but was respectful. He looked at Eliza. "Miss Mercer," he said. "I'll be honest, I've been doing the housekeeping and I've been making a real mess of it." "I can see that from here," Eliza said, looking at the kitchen window. The glass was filmed over with something that appeared to be a combination of grease and smoke. Garrett almost smiled. "I'll get your things settled." "I don't have things," Eliza said. "I have what I'm wearing." He absorbed this without visible reaction. "I'll find you some then. Silas has things in storage from—" He stopped. Silas, who had dismounted and was loosening his horse's girth, didn't turn around. "From the last time the house was occupied properly. They'll fit well enough for now. We can arrange to get her what she needs from town." Garrett nodded. He looked at Eliza once more, and whatever calculation he'd been running behind his eyes settled into something she recognized as basic good faith. He was waiting to see who she was. That was fair. "Come on, then," he said. "I'll show you the kitchen first. I'll warn you now, it's going to upset you." "Probably not as much as my morning was," Eliza said. This time Garrett actually smiled. It changed his whole face. The kitchen upset her approximately as much as she'd expected. Garrett had not been exaggerating. The stove needed cleaning badly. The dry larder had been organized by someone who apparently believed that organization was optional. There were pots stacked in configurations that defied both physics and good sense, and someone had attempted to repair a shelf with what appeared to be pieces of a broken chair. But the stove itself was a good one. A 6-burner cast iron range that had been expensive when it was new and was still capable of excellent work if you treated it properly. The window over the dry sink, once she'd wiped it clean, faced east. And the larder, for all its disorder, was well stocked. She spent the next hour putting it right. She didn't ask for help. She just started at one end and worked toward the other, and Garrett checked on her once and then left her to it, which was the right call. By the time Silas came in from the barn, the kitchen smelled like something cooking, and the stove was clean, and the window was clear, and the shelves were in order. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at her. "I told you it was decent," he said. "The stove is excellent," Eliza said. "The rest of it was a catastrophe, but we've addressed that." He came in and sat at the table with the weight of a man who'd been on horseback for many hours and was done with it. He put his hat on the table. His hair was pressed down where the hat had been, and he pushed a hand through it. "There's a few things I should say before the day's over," he said. She turned from the stove. "Go ahead." "You're an employee. I want that to be clear to both of us. I'm not—" He paused. "Some people in town are going to make assumptions about the situation, about why I brought you out here. I can't stop them from making those assumptions, and I'm not going to pretend they won't be made. But I want you to know, from my side, what this is and what it isn't." She watched his face while he said this. He was looking at the table, the way people sometimes do when they're making sure the words come out straight. "I hear you," she said. "If you're ever uncomfortable here, for any reason at all, you come to me or to Garrett. And if it's me that's making you uncomfortable, then you go to Garrett." "Do you think that's likely?" He met her eyes. "No. But I've known men who'd have said the same thing and not meant it. So I'm saying it and meaning it, and I understand if it takes you some time to believe that." She turned back to the stove and checked what was in the pot. It needed another 20 minutes. "My room," she said. "You mentioned I'd have a key." "It's on the hook by the door, the brass one." She went and looked. It was there. A small brass key on a nail hook by the kitchen door, with a piece of cord through it. She took it off the hook and held it in her palm for a moment. Then she tucked it into her pocket next to the legal papers. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that went deeper than politeness. Silas looked at her for a moment, and then he looked away, out the clean window, at the mountains turning purple in the last of the light. "Supper smells like something worth waiting for," he said. "It's just stew," Eliza said. "But I made it." "That'll do," Silas said. Outside in the corral, the horses moved slowly in the fading light, and somewhere higher on the north ridge, the cattle grazed in the early dark, and the ranch settled into its evening sounds. And Eliza Mercer stood at a stove that was finally clean and stirred a pot of stew and listened to the quiet, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, she did not feel afraid. But somewhere on the road between Red Hollow and the North Ridge, a shadow that she didn't yet know about had begun to move, slow and patient and in no hurry at all, because the kind of man who had watched from the crowd with pale eyes and a straight coat was not the kind of man who accepted a transaction as final. Eliza didn't know this yet. She would. The stew lasted 2 days. Eliza made a large pot of it that first evening, more than 3 people needed, but she'd learned early in life that cooking too little was a different kind of problem than cooking too much, and she'd rather have leftovers than have someone go wanting. Silas ate 2 bowls without comment. Garrett ate 3 and said it was the best thing he'd put in his mouth since spring. Neither of them made a fuss about it, which she appreciated. She wasn't looking for praise. She was looking to establish that she could do the work she'd said she could do, and the empty pot by the end of the second day seemed to settle that question. The first week on the North Ridge passed in the way that first weeks do when you're learning the rhythm of a new place. Slowly at first, and then all at once. She woke early, before the men, which was intentional. The morning was hers in a way nothing had been hers in a long time, and she guarded it carefully. She would start the stove, put coffee on, stand at the east window while the light came up over the mountain in slow stages, and allow herself a few minutes of simply being in a place where nobody was about to ask anything of her. Then she would work. The house had been maintained structurally. Silas was not a man who let walls fall in or roofs go unfixed, but the domestic details had been handled by someone who fundamentally did not care about domestic details. She found this in small ways daily. A drawer in the kitchen that had been nailed shut rather than repaired. A pantry shelf that tilted 3 degrees to the left and had never been corrected. A rug in the front room that had been positioned, she could only assume, by a man who had looked at it once and then never looked at it again. She fixed what she could fix herself and left notes about the rest. Not demanding notes, practical ones, written in her clear, small handwriting and left in obvious places. Garrett found the first one on the tilted shelf and read it twice, and then came to find her. "You want me to fix the shelf," he said. It's your house too, she said. I'm just noting what needs doing. It's Silas's house. You've lived here 7 years. That makes it yours in the ways that count. He looked at her for a moment with his particular expression, not closed off, just careful, the face of a man who'd learned to take his time forming opinions. Then he went and got his tools and fixed the shelf. After that, the notes became a system. She would write them. He would address them, or Silas would, or occasionally they would discuss whether something actually needed addressing at all, which led to the first real conversations she had on the ranch that weren't purely functional. Silas, it turned out, had opinions about where things should be kept that were completely irrational but deeply held. He believed, for instance, that the best place for the extra lantern was on the floor in the corner of the front room, because that was where it had always been, and changing its location would result in him walking into the dark, looking for it in the wrong place. You know where it would never be in the dark? Eliza said. On a hook by the door where you reach for it automatically. I don't reach automatically in that direction. You'd learn to. I'm 37 years old. I've been reaching for that lantern in that corner for 6 years. That's 6 years of a habit that doesn't serve you. He gave her a look that was half exasperated and half something she couldn't quite identify, and then he let the matter drop, and the lantern stayed on the floor in the corner for another week and a half. Then one morning she came down to find it on a hook by the door. And when she saw Silas at breakfast, she said nothing about it, and he said nothing about it, and they both drank their coffee. She was slowly learning how Silas Boone communicated a great many things. Not with words, which he used sparingly and carefully. With actions, which he chose deliberately and then didn't explain. The rumor started in the second week. Garrett mentioned it first, with the directness that she'd come to understand was simply his way. He came in from a supply run into town and set the bags on the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "People are talking." Eliza kept chopping. About what? About you being here. About Silas buying you at the auction. He paused. Some people are saying it's a marriage arrangement. What do you say? I say it's none of my business and none of theirs. He started pulling things out of the bags and handing them to her to put away. But you should know. Because some of those people are going to show up here eventually wanting to see for themselves. She understood what he was telling her. In a place like this, rumor moved the same way weather did. You couldn't stop it, but you could decide how you were going to stand when it arrived. Let them come, she said. I've got nothing to hide. Garrett nodded. He put a sack of flour on the counter. There's something else. She stopped chopping. Man in town was asking about you. Fella I didn't recognize. Asking at the feed store who the woman was that Silas Boone brought up to the ridge. She set the knife down. What did he look like? Tall. Well-dressed for the territory. Pale eyes. She did not say anything for a moment. You know who that is? Garrett said. It wasn't a question. I might, she said. His name is Benedict Cross. He was at the auction. He was the other bidder. Garrett absorbed this the way he absorbed most information, quietly and thoroughly. You want me to tell Silas? I'll tell him myself, she said. Tonight. But when evening came and she sat across the table from Silas after supper with the intention of telling him, something made her hesitate. I was tired. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he'd been slower getting up from the table the last few days. The cattle needed moving to the upper range, and he and Garrett had been doing the work of 4 men. It felt wrong to add something to that weight when she wasn't even certain yet that Cross being in town meant what she feared it might mean. Tall men with pale eyes asked questions about things for all kinds of reasons. She didn't actually know what Cross wanted. She told herself she would wait and see. This was a mistake, though she wouldn't fully understand that for another 10 days. The riding lessons started by accident. Eliza had told Silas she could ride, which was true. She could stay on a horse and get from one place to another without falling off, which was the functional definition of the skill. But she'd been on the bay mare 3 times now for short errands around the property, and it was becoming apparent that what she had was less riding and more surviving on a horse. Silas noticed. He didn't say anything directly, because he was Silas. But one afternoon when she came back from fetching water from the upper spring, he was at the corral fence watching her dismount, and he said, "You're gripping the reins too tight." "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. You'd be better if you weren't gripping so tight. The horse can feel your hands." She looked at him. "Are you offering to teach me?" He shrugged, which she'd learned to translate as yes. So in the late afternoons, when the main work of the day was done and the light was still good, she would take the bay mare out to the flat ground south of the barn, and Silas would stand at the fence and occasionally say things. Not many things, but the things he said were specific and useful in the way that made her feel she was learning rather than being corrected. "Don't fight her," he said one afternoon. "When she wants to go left, don't pull hard right. Ask her, give a little, then ask." "That seems like I'm letting her win." "It's not about winning. You're having a conversation. She gives you what you want when she understands what you want." Eliza tried it. The mare, who had been tossing her head in protest, went smooth and easy in the space of a few strides. "Huh," Eliza said. "Yeah," Silas said, and she could hear the almost smile in his voice even from across the corral. She started looking forward to those late afternoons in a way she hadn't expected. Not because of what she was learning, exactly, though she was learning, because it was one of the few times during the day when the business of the ranch fell away, and there was just the animal under her, and the man at the fence, and the mountains all around them going gold in the late light. She did not let herself think about this too carefully. She was an employee. She had a room with a key. The arrangement was clear. She thought about it anyway. Look, 3 weeks after she arrived, a woman named Agnes Holloway rode up the trail from the south with her husband Clive and their teenage son. And before she was even properly off her horse, she was looking at Eliza with the particular expression of a woman who had arrived to verify a rumor. Agnes was maybe 50, with sharp dark eyes and the manner of a person accustomed to being the most well-informed person in any room. Her husband Clive was a lean, weathered man who looked like he spent most of his life outdoors and preferred it. They were ranchers from the valley below, neighbors by the broad frontier definition of the word, which meant within 20 miles. "We heard Silas had taken on a housekeeper," Agnes said, accepting a cup of coffee in the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd sat in that kitchen before. "We thought we'd come say welcome." "That's kind of you," Eliza said. Agnes looked at her over the rim of the cup. Clive was outside with Silas. The teenage son, whose name was apparently Thomas, though Agnes called him Tom, had found Garrett in the barn and was talking his ear off about horses. "How are you finding it up here?" Agnes said. "The work suits me. The house needed attention." "I imagine it did." Agnes looked around the kitchen with what Eliza read as genuine assessment. "I used to come up here when Ruth was alive, Silas's wife. She kept it beautifully." She looked back at Eliza. "She died 4 years ago. Fever, in the winter." Eliza hadn't known. Silas had not mentioned a wife, but she understood now what Garrett had stopped himself from saying that first day, about the storage items that would fit her well enough. They had been Ruth's. She kept her face even. "I didn't know," she said. "He doesn't talk about it." Agnes set her cup down. "He doesn't talk about much, which I expect you've noticed." She paused. "He's a good man, Eliza. Whatever people are saying in Red Hollow, I want you to know that from someone who's known him 15 years. He's a good man, and he's had a hard few years, and I'm glad there's someone up here looking after the house properly." Eliza wasn't sure exactly what to say. "Thank you." Agnes nodded briskly, the way a woman does when she's said the important thing and is ready to move on. "Now, I've brought you some things from my kitchen garden. Seed packets. Because you need a kitchen garden up here, and whoever has been running this place clearly didn't think so." "Nobody argued," Eliza said. "Clive says that's because Garrett would eat rocks if you cooked them right." Eliza laughed. It surprised her. Not the laugh itself, but the ease of it, the way it came out without planning. Agnes smiled at her, sharp and warm at the same time, and Eliza had the sense of a person deciding something. The storm came in the last week of October without much warning, which was how storms came in the high country. The sky went from clear to gray to black in the space of an afternoon, and then the wind hit, and after the wind came sleet, and then snow, real snow, driving sideways in the dark. Eliza had seen storms before. She had not seen one like this. By evening, the temperature had dropped sharply enough that you could see your breath inside the front room, and the sound of the wind against the roof was a constant roaring that made normal conversation impossible. Silas and Garrett moved the horses into the barn and battened down what needed battening. Eliza kept the stove going hard and pushed furniture away from the windows, which were old and not perfectly sealed. She was in the middle of this when she heard the knocking. She almost didn't hear it at all. The wind was making that much noise. But she'd moved near the front door, and there it was again, faint but deliberate. Not the random striking of a branch or a shutter. Someone knocking. She opened the door and the wind shoved it back hard, and she had to use both hands to hold it. Standing on the porch, half collapsed against the doorframe, were two people, a man and a woman. The man with one arm around the woman's waist, both of them soaked through and shaking so badly she could see it from 2 feet away. "Please," the man said. Just the one word. Eliza didn't hesitate. She stepped back and pulled the door wide and waved them in, and then she had to put her shoulder against the door to close it against the wind. The man's name was Daniel Farrow. The woman was his wife, Clara. They'd been caught on the trail trying to make it to a cousin's claim 15 miles east before the storm closed in, and their horse had thrown a shoe and gone lame 3 miles back, and they'd walked the rest of it in the dark and the wind with no real certainty of finding anything at the end of it. Clara Farrow was pregnant. Visibly, significantly pregnant. Eliza took stock of this in approximately 2 seconds and made several decisions in the next 3. She got them to the fire. She got wet coats and boots off. She got blankets. She put a pot of water on to heat, and she went to find Silas in the barn. He came in, took one look, and said, "How far along is she?" "I don't know. 8 months, maybe. She's cold and exhausted." "Is she—" "She's not in labor. Not yet." Eliza lowered her voice. "Silas, I don't know what to do if she goes into labor." He met her eyes. "Neither do I." This was a terrible thing to admit, and also, she understood, exactly the right thing to say. He wasn't going to pretend competence he didn't have. Neither was she. "We get her warm first," he said, "and we hope the storm breaks by morning." The storm did not break by morning. What it did instead was continue, and then intensify just before dawn in a way that made the earlier part of the night feel like a preview. The temperature kept dropping. The snow was past the window ledges on the north side of the house. Garrett reported that the barn roof was holding, but only just, and that 2 of the fence sections on the east side had come down. And Clara Farrow, who had been sleeping fitfully on the couch under every blanket Eliza owned, woke up at 3 in the morning and looked at Eliza with wide, frightened eyes and said, "I think something's happening." Eliza did not panic. She would think about this later, about how she didn't panic, and she would credit it to the simple fact that panic required a moment of hesitation, and in that moment there was simply no time for it. She called for Silas. She called for Garrett, who turned out to know considerably more about this situation than he'd let on, having been present for the birth of his own 4 children back before his wife died. He took charge in a quiet, efficient way that made everyone in the room breathe slightly easier. Daniel Farrow sat in the kitchen with his head in his hands and prayed to no one in particular. Eliza stayed with Clara. She held her hand. She kept her talking between the bad moments, partly to distract her, and partly because talking meant breathing, and breathing meant staying calm, or calm enough. "Tell me about the cousin," Eliza said, during one of the longer quiet stretches. "Where do they live?" "Marcy and her husband," Clara said, and her voice was strained but present. "They've got a claim near a creek. Marcy's got 3 kids already. I don't know how she does it." "You'll ask her when you get there." Clara looked at her. "Do you have children?" "No." "Do you want them?" The question was so direct and so simple that Eliza answered it honestly without thinking. "I think I do, someday." She paused. "I haven't thought about it much. There were other things to think about." Clara nodded like this made perfect sense. Then her face changed and she gripped Eliza's hand hard enough to hurt, and the quiet stretch was over. The baby, a girl, small and loud and apparently furious about being born in a blizzard, arrived just before 5 in the morning. Garrett handled the practical necessities with practiced efficiency. Silas brought heated water and clean cloth. Eliza held Clara's hand through the worst of it and tried not to show on her face any of the fear she felt. And when the baby cried, that first raw, indignant sound, something happened in Eliza's chest that she didn't have words for. Daniel Farrow came through the doorway at the sound and stopped dead in his tracks. "A girl," Garrett said, and his voice came out rougher than usual. Daniel crossed the room in 4 strides and sat on the floor next to his wife and took her face in his hands and didn't say anything at all for a long time. Eliza stepped back. She found herself in the doorway of the front room, and she stood there for a moment just breathing, and then Silas was beside her. "You did well," he said quietly. "Garrett did the work." You kept her calm for 3 hours in the middle of a blizzard. That's not nothing. She looked at the small, disheveled family on the other side of the room. Clara exhausted and radiant, Daniel undone in the best possible way, the baby between them doing whatever brand new babies do. And she felt something that she finally recognized after a moment as longing. Clean, simple, uncomplicated longing for something she hadn't let herself want in a long time. She became aware that Silas was watching her. She turned away from the door. "I'll put more coffee on," she said. "That'd be good," he said. She went to the kitchen and she put the kettle on and she stood at the stove for a moment with both hands flat on the warm iron and just breathed. The Pharaohs stayed 3 days while the storm finished and the snow settled and Daniel's horse was brought up from where they'd left it and its shoe was replaced by Garrett, who could do most things that needed doing. On the morning they left, Clara found Eliza in the kitchen and hugged her without preamble. "I'm naming her Elizabeth," Clara said, "if that's all right with you." Eliza didn't know what to say. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Clara pulled back and looked at her. "You were the steadiest person in that room. I needed steady." She glanced toward the front room where Daniel and Silas were talking quietly. "He's a good man, you know. Your—" She paused. "Employer," Eliza said. Clara looked at her for a moment with an expression that said she had opinions about this word choice. She didn't share those opinions. She just nodded and picked up her baby and went to find her husband. It was 2 days after the Pharaohs left that Garrett came back from checking the fence line on the eastern edge of the property and told Silas, and then Silas told Eliza, that there had been riders on the ridge above, 2 of them, from the tracks. They'd stayed up there for a while, the snow held the impressions well, and then they'd gone back south. "Watching the house?" Eliza said. "Looks like," Garrett said. Silas looked at her carefully. "Is there something you haven't told me?" She thought about Benedict Cross with his pale eyes and his straight coat, asking questions in Red Hollow about where she'd gone. She thought about waiting to see. "Yes," she said. "I should have told you sooner." She told him about Cross. She told him everything she knew, which wasn't much, just the way he'd looked at her from the crowd and what Garrett had reported from town, and the feeling she'd carried since the auction that Cross was not a man who accepted outcomes that didn't go his way. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me when Garrett first mentioned it?" It was a fair question. She could have given him a careful answer, about not being sure, about not wanting to add to his workload. All of that was true. "Because I've been taking care of things myself my whole life," she said, "and I'm still learning that I don't have to." He held her gaze for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Now I know. Now we deal with it." "What does dealing with it look like?" "It looks like paying attention," he said, "and making sure you're not alone when you don't need to be, and it looks like—" He stopped. "What?" "It looks like me going into Red Hollow and asking some questions of my own," he said, "because I know people there who know things, and it's time I use that." She wanted to tell him to be careful, and she stopped herself because he would be careful, and she didn't need to say it, and saying it would sound like something else entirely that she wasn't ready to name. "All right," she said. He left for Red Hollow the next morning before she was up, and she found his coffee cup on the table, rinsed out, which was new, which was something she'd mentioned once and not repeated. And she stood in the quiet kitchen with the east window full of pale morning light and felt the weight of the empty house around her like something she hadn't expected. She did not like how much she noticed his absence. She did not like it at all. But the feeling was there, clear and undeniable. And Eliza Mercer had spent too many years pretending things weren't true to start again now. Silas came back from Red Hollow on the second day, later than Eliza had expected, and she knew from the way he tied his horse at the post, not in the barn, not yet, just the post, like a man who had things to say before he could settle, that what he'd found was worse than either of them had hoped. She was in the kitchen when he came through the door. He took his hat off and set it on the table and sat down, and she poured him coffee without being asked and sat across from him. He drank half the cup before he spoke. "Benedict Cross is not who he said he was," Silas said. "His name isn't Cross. That's the first thing. His real name, best anyone can determine, is Elias Bench. He came from St. Louis originally. Before that, nobody's sure." Eliza kept her hands flat on the table. "What does he do?" "He buys debts." Silas turned the cup in his hands. "He finds men who owe money, big money, to the wrong people, and he buys their debt notes for a fraction of what they're worth. Then he collects on them. But not with money. He paused. He collects with property, businesses, land, people sometimes, if he can make it legal looking enough. The kitchen was very quiet.
Bought my father's debt, Eliza said. 3 weeks before the auction. Your father owed a gambling house in Benton about $400. Cross, bench, paid it off for $200 and took the note. Then he came to your father and told him the only way to settle was the auction. Silas met her eyes. Your father didn't come up with that arrangement himself. Bench engineered it. He wanted you in that auction so he could buy you. She heard this. She let it move through her and settle. Then she said, he was going to be the only bidder. That was the plan.
The people in that crowd were mostly there for show. A few of them were in Bench's pocket, there to run up the price for appearances. Nobody was supposed to go past $150. He set the cup down. And then I showed up. And you went to $250. I went to $250. He rubbed the side of his jaw. There was more stubble than usual. He'd been on the road, hadn't slept properly. He wasn't expecting that. He wasn't expecting anyone to show up with cash and outbid him. So now he's angry. He's not angry. Men like that don't get angry exactly. They get, he looked for the word, inconvenienced. And when they get inconvenienced, they look for the legal mechanism that puts things back the way they planned them, which is what he's been doing for the last 6 weeks while we thought he was just asking questions. Eliza's stomach tightened. What mechanism? Silas looked at her directly. Your father signed a second note before the auction. A document that Bench had drawn up saying that the auction proceeds were paid in advance against future services. Bench is arguing that when I paid the $250 and your father signed the bill of sale, what actually transferred was that pre-existing note. Not you, but the debt your father owed. And since Bench holds that note, he's saying he still owns it, whatever it represents. He's saying the bill of sale I have is meaningless because your father didn't have the legal authority to sell what he'd already promised to Bench. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Eliza got up from the table because she needed to do something with her body, needed to be moving. She went to the window. The mountain was there, the same as always, indifferent and enormous. The notarized document, she said. The Declaration of Freedom, the one you had drawn up before the auction. That's what I have. That's the piece Bench didn't plan for. He didn't know I was coming. He didn't know anyone had thought ahead. Silas's voice was steady, but she could hear the effort in it. The problem is that territorial law on documents like that is not clear. The judge in Benton, Harlan Oates, he's the man who'd rule on something like this. And Judge Oates has done business with Bench before. She turned from the window. So the judge is compromised. I don't know that for certain. I know they've had dealings. I know Oates ruled in Bench's favor twice in land disputes that other lawyers said were close calls. He stopped. I've got a lawyer in Benton named Aldrich who's honest and who's good. I sent him a message 2 days ago. He'll look at what we have and tell me how it stands. And in the meantime, Bench is going to come here, not himself. He doesn't do things himself. He'll send men with papers. He held her gaze. Eliza, I need you to understand that when that happens, I will not let them take you. But I need you to be ready for this to be a fight that doesn't get resolved quickly or cleanly. She stood at the window and looked at him, sitting at her kitchen table with his coffee going cold and his hat beside it. And she thought about Roy Mercer counting money in the September sun, and Benedict Cross walking away with his coat straight, and the brass key in her pocket, and Clara Farrow's hand in hers at 3 a.m. I've been in fights that didn't resolve quickly, she said. I'm still here. Something in his face shifted. It wasn't relief. It was closer to the look of a man who has been bracing for a wall to hold and watches it hold. All right, he said. Then we work. Garrett took it the way Garrett took most serious news, which was to be still for a moment and then ask the most practical question available. In this case, do we know when? No, Silas said. Could be a week, could be less. Then we get the fence on the east side properly fixed, and we make sure we know who's coming up that trail before they get close. Garrett looked at Eliza. You're not to be out alone on the property. I understand, she said, before he could finish the sentence. He nodded. And I'm going to reach out to Clive Holloway. He said last time if Silas ever needed, don't bring Clive into this yet, Silas said. Not until we know what we're dealing with. I'm not going to drag neighbors into my trouble before I have to. It's my trouble too, Eliza said. Both men looked at her. I mean, that practically not... She stopped. What I mean is that if you're deciding who needs to know and when, I should be part of that decision. It concerns me most directly. Silas and Garrett exchanged a look. Then Silas said, Fair enough. Clive Holloway, she said. And Agnes. Agnes is smart and she knows people. She might know things about Bench's other dealings that could help Aldrich's case. Another look between the men. Garrett almost smiled. She's not wrong, he said. She usually isn't, Silas said, and there was something in his voice on those 3 words that was not quite simple agreement, and Eliza very deliberately did not look at his face when he said it. The days that followed had a strange quality to them. The surface of them was ordinary, the work of the ranch continuing as it always did. The morning routines and the meals and the late afternoon writing lessons that had somehow continued even now, even with everything else pressing. But underneath the ordinary surface there was a wire pulled tight, and everyone on the ranch felt it. Agnes Holloway came up the second day after Silas's return, and she sat in the kitchen for 3 hours with a cup of tea and what turned out to be a remarkable amount of information about Elias Bench's activities in the valley below. He'd approached 2 other ranchers about land purchases in the last month. Both declined. Both told Agnes they'd felt something off about the man without being able to name it. He'd been seen twice at Judge Oates's house, which was social enough to not be provable, and Agnes knew a woman in Benton named Margaret Sills, who had worked as a clerk for the firm Bench used for his legal documents. Margaret is not fond of the man, Agnes said precisely, and Margaret has a memory like a steel trap. If there are document irregularities in what Bench filed, she'll know. Can you reach her? Eliza asked. I can write her today. She's careful, but she's not frightened. There's a difference. Agnes looked at Silas. You should know this is going to make Bench very unhappy when it goes wrong for him. Men like that don't take losing well. I know, Silas said. You're prepared for what unhappy looks like. I'm prepared for whatever it looks like. Agnes looked at him for a moment with the appraising expression of a woman who has known someone long enough to know what they're made of, and then she nodded. Good. Then let's make sure it goes wrong for him properly. The men came on a Tuesday, 11 days after Silas had returned from Red Hollow. Eliza was in the kitchen when Garrett appeared in the doorway and said quietly, Riders coming up the South Trail, 4 of them. And then she looked at his face and said equally quietly, How many of them are carrying? All of them, he said. She took the brass key out of her pocket. She'd taken to keeping it there rather than on the hook, for no reason she could have explained logically, and she set it on the kitchen window sill. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and went to the front room. Silas was already at the door. He'd been expecting this, they all had, but she could see in the tight set of his jaw that expecting something and having it arrive were different things. Stay inside, he said, without turning around. No, she said. He turned then. He looked at her. I'm not hiding in the kitchen, she said. If they're here about me, I'll be there when they arrive. I'm not going to stand behind a door while men decide what happens to my life. I did that once. I'm not doing it again. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something worked its way across his face. Not agreement exactly, but something that recognized something. Stay behind me, he said, until I understand what they have. All right. They went out onto the porch together. The 4 riders came up the trail at a deliberate pace, the pace of men who are trying to project authority rather than urgency. 3 of them were hard-looking, the kind of men hired for their size and their willingness, their faces doing that careful blank thing that men do when they've been told to look official. The 4th man, riding slightly ahead, was different. He was in his 40s, thin, with a lawyer's hands and a leather case across his saddle, and he looked like a man who was used to having law on his side and finding it a comfortable place to stand. Roy Mercer was not with them. This surprised Eliza more than she'd expected. She had braced for her father's face, had prepared, without fully realizing it, for the particular blow of seeing him arrive to finish what he'd started. His absence was both a relief and a different kind of hurt, the hurt of understanding that he hadn't even bothered to come. The thin man stopped his horse 10 feet from the porch. Silas Boone? That's me, Silas said. My name is Petworth. I represent the interests of Mr. Elias Bench in this matter. He reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded document. I'm here to inform you that the transaction conducted in Red Hollow on September the 4th of this year has been determined to be legally invalid. Mr. Bench holds a prior claim against the person of Eliza Mercer through a debt instrument signed by Roy Mercer. The bill of sale you received does not supersede that instrument. He held out the document. This is a notice of reclamation. The woman is to be surrendered immediately. Garrett, who had come around from the side of the barn, stood at the corner of the porch with his arms crossed. One of the hired men looked at him and then looked away. Silas did not move toward the document. I'd like to see the debt instrument you're referring to. Petworth hesitated. That document is, if you're telling me a prior claim supersedes my bill of sale, I'd like to see the document that establishes that claim. That's a reasonable request. You're a lawyer. You know it is. Petworth's jaw moved. He reached into the leather case and produced a second document. Silas came down the porch steps and took it. He read it carefully. He read it a second time. He folded it and held it in his hand and looked at Petworth. This is dated August the 28th, Silas said. The auction was September the 4th. The document my lawyer is holding, the notarized Declaration of Freedom, is dated September the 1st. The date of the debt instrument is not. The date matters, Silas said, because my document establishes Eliza Mercer as a free person under territorial law 3 days before the auction took place. Whatever Roy Mercer signed on August the 28th doesn't change what the territory had already established on September the 1st. He handed the document back. Your claim isn't prior. Mine is. Petworth stared at him. The thin, smooth face had developed a slight color across the cheekbones. That interpretation of territorial law will be argued in front of Judge Oates, Silas said. Or if it turns out Judge Oates has a conflict of interest in this case, which my lawyer is currently investigating, in front of a federal circuit judge. He paused. Your client knows my lawyer's name. He should ask him about circuit judges and what happens to debt schemes when they go federal. The color in Petworth's face deepened. He looked for the first time uncertain. One of the hired men shifted in his saddle. The movement was small, but it was there, and Eliza saw Garrett see it, and she watched Garrett very calmly shift his own weight in a way that made the hired man go still again. This matter is not concluded, Petworth said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice. No, Silas agreed. It isn't, but it won't be concluded here today with 4 men and a notice of reclamation. You tell your client that. He looked at the hired men briefly, then back at Petworth. You're welcome to water your horses at the trough before you ride back. It's a long way. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Petworth tucked his documents back into the leather case with the clipped precision of a man controlling his temper, turned his horse, and said something quiet to the hired men. They watered their horses. They rode back down the south trail without looking at the porch. Eliza stood on the porch and watched them go and did not let out the breath she'd been holding until they were past the first bend. Then she let it out, slowly. He's going to come back, she said. Yes, Silas said, with more than a lawyer. Probably. He turned and looked at her. Are you all right? She started to say fine, which was the automatic answer, the one she'd been giving since she was old enough to understand that saying fine was how you got people to stop looking at you too carefully. She stopped herself. No, not entirely. He nodded, like this was a reasonable and complete answer. Come inside, he said. I need to send a message to Aldrich. The message went out that afternoon. The reply came back 2 days later by way of a rider Aldrich trusted, a young man named Freed, who made the trip in 5 hours and looked like he'd earned every minute of it. Aldrich's letter was 3 pages long and written in a small, careful hand. Silas read it at the kitchen table with Garrett on one side and Eliza on the other, and his face went through several things she watched carefully. The good news, he said when he finished, is that Aldrich believes the notarized document holds. He's found 2 territorial precedents that support it. And the bad news, Garrett said. The bad news is that Bench's people filed with Judge Oates 2 days ago, before I even knew they were coming here. Oates has the case, and Oates has scheduled a hearing for 3 weeks from Thursday. He set the letter down. Aldrich wants to file for a change of venue based on conflict of interest, but that takes time, and in the meantime, Oates could issue an interim order. He looked at Eliza. Which could mean men coming here with legal authority to... I understand, she said. She looked at the letter, at the small, careful handwriting. What does Aldrich need? Witnesses.
People who were at the auction who can testify that the process was manipulated, that the bidders were arranged, that the auction wasn't legitimate, and documentation of Bench's other debt schemes. If we can show a pattern, Agnes Holloway's contact, Eliza said immediately. Margaret Sills, Agnes said she has records. If she'll give them. Agnes can ask her. Agnes is... Eliza stopped. She thought about Agnes in this kitchen with her tea and her steel trap memory and her expression that said she'd already decided. Agnes will convince her. Silas looked at her. And the auction witnesses. People in that crowd who weren't Bench's men. People who saw what happened. Eliza thought about the faces she remembered. The crowd had been mostly men she didn't know. But there had been women on the edges. She remembered a woman in a blue dress near the feed store steps, who had looked at the platform with an expression of undisguised disgust. She remembered a rancher near the back who had turned and walked away before the bidding was over, which meant he'd seen enough to be uncomfortable. I can describe them, she said. I can tell you everything I remember. Your people in Red Hollow, can they find them from descriptions? Garrett can. He knows more people in Red Hollow than I do. Garrett made a sound that was not quite modesty. I know the right people. I'll go tomorrow. Take the list of names Aldrich sent, Silas said. The men he believes were Bench's arranged bidders, if any of them are willing to talk. People who were in Bench's pocket are generally not keen to testify, Garrett said. They might be if they knew the thing was going federal, Silas said. Federal exposure changes the calculation pretty fast. Garrett absorbed this. All right, I'll go tomorrow. That night, after supper, after Garrett had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch had settled into its nighttime sounds, Eliza stayed at the kitchen table longer than she usually did. She had the legal papers out, the notarized declaration, the bill of sale, Aldrich's letter, and she was reading through them again the way you read things when you're trying to find the place where you might have missed something. She heard Silas come back in from his last walk around the property. He did this every night, checking things. And she heard him pause in the front room. Come in if you want, she said. He came in and sat across from her. He looked at the papers. I've been thinking, she said. About what? About what happens if we lose the hearing. She kept her voice level. If Oates rules against us before Aldrich can get a change of venue, what does that actually look like? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, It looks like men with a court order. And you can't stop men with a court order. Not without... He stopped. Without breaking the law, she finished, which you won't do. No, I won't do that. He met her eyes. But we're not going to lose the hearing. You don't know that. No, he admitted. I don't know that. But I know Aldrich is good. And I know what we have is strong. And I know... He stopped again, differently this time, like he'd run up against something he hadn't planned to say. What? She said. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked up. I know that I'm not going to let this end the way Bench planned it. Whatever it takes. Within the law, Eliza, I mean that. Whatever it takes within the law, I will spend every dollar I have and every favor I'm owed and every piece of leverage Aldrich can find. He said this not dramatically but flatly, the way a man states a fact about the weather. You deserve to have someone fight for you, someone who isn't going to stop. The kitchen was very still. She had been keeping something at a certain distance for weeks, had been naming it employee, had been naming it gratitude, had been naming it any number of things that were technically accurate, and also, she was beginning to understand, entirely insufficient. And sitting across from him with the lamp between them and the papers spread on the table and the mountain outside the window making its silent, enormous presence known, she let herself look at it directly for the first time. Silas, she said. I know, he said. I'm not saying it like an expectation. I want you to understand that. I do understand that. Because you're an employee and I told you, I know what you told me. She folded her hands on the table. I'm going to tell you something now, and I need you to just hear it, without doing anything about it immediately. He waited. She started carefully. I don't think of this place as a job anymore. I haven't for a while. I think of it as... She found the word, and it was simple and correct, and she said it. Home. He was very still. I'm not saying that to complicate things, she said. I'm saying it because it's true. And I've spent my whole life not saying things that were true because they were inconvenient, and I don't want to do that anymore. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with its low, sustained sound. A horse shifted in the corral. Somewhere high on the ridge, an owl made its single flat note. "All right," Silas said. His voice had changed in some way that was small and significant. "All right," Eliza said. Neither of them said anything else, but when she gathered the papers and went to her room, she was aware of his presence on the other side of the wall in a way that was no longer something she needed to talk herself out of. 3 days later, the situation changed entirely. Garrett came back from Red Hollow with 2 witnesses willing to testify. A woman named Daisy Crum, who had been working at the feed store the morning of the auction and had heard Roy Mercer and one of Bench's men discussing the arranged bidders through the wall, and a rancher named Fisk, who had attended out of curiosity and left in disgust and was now willing to put that disgust on paper. But he also brought news that knocked every other consideration sideways. Roy Mercer was in Red Hollow, had been there 2 days, and he was not there with Bench's people. He was there alone, apparently, drinking steadily at the saloon and telling anyone who would listen that he'd made a mistake. Eliza sat with this information for a long time. Garrett delivered it straight, without editorializing. He was good at that. Silas waited. It was Eliza's information to process. "Is he trying to make contact with me?" she said finally. "From what I heard, he's been asking if anyone knows how to get a message to the North Ridge." She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out. The mountains were doing what mountains did, sitting there, massive and unreachable and completely unconcerned with human trouble. "What could he possibly say?" she said quietly, not quite a question. "I don't know," Garrett said. She turned around. "Does Aldrich know he's there?" "I told Aldrich's office before I left." "Good." She thought about it. "If my father is having second thoughts, if he saw what Bench actually is and is scared, that's a different thing than him wanting to apologize to me. And right now, what matters is what he knows about the debt instrument and whether he'll testify to how it was obtained." Both men were watching her. "I know," she said. "I know that's—" She exhaled. "I know it's cold to think about it that way." "It's not cold," Silas said. "It's clear-headed. I'm angry at him." She said it without drama. "I've been angry at him my whole life, and I've been pushing it down because it wasn't useful. Right now it's still not useful, so I'm going to keep pushing it down. But I want you both to know it's there." "We know," Garrett said. She nodded. She looked at Silas. "Can Aldrich arrange to speak with him? Without me being there? I'll write him today." "And if my father won't cooperate with Aldrich?" "Then we use what we have," Silas said. "We go to the hearing with Daisy Crum and Fisk and Margaret Sills's records and the notarized document, and we make the strongest case we can." She looked at him. "And if that's not enough?" He held her gaze. "Then we figure out what's next. Together." The word landed quietly between them. Together. Not a promise exactly, but something that carried the weight of one. She turned back to the papers on the table. "All right," she said, "let's write to Aldrich." But as she sat down and reached for the pen, she heard something that made her go still, a sound from outside down the trail. Not riders, something else, something she didn't immediately recognize. Garrett heard it too. He went to the window. Then he turned, and his face had the flat, careful expression he used when things were serious, and he said, "There's a man coming up the trail on foot, no horse." He paused. "He's carrying a white cloth." Eliza stood up slowly. She knew, without being told, without seeing his face or his walk or any of the details that she would have said she needed. She knew the way you know certain things about people you've lived alongside your whole life, people who have shaped the very particular way you understand pain. "It's my father," she said. Roy Mercer looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing Eliza noticed, standing on the porch with Silas to her left and Garrett at the corner, watching her father come up the last stretch of the trail on foot with his white cloth. An actual handkerchief, it turned out, tied to the end of a stick like something out of a war story. He was limping slightly. His coat was dirty at the knees, which meant he'd fallen somewhere on the trail, and his face had the particular gray cast of a man who had been drinking hard for several days and had recently stopped. He stopped about 20 feet from the porch. He looked at Eliza. He did not look at Silas or Garrett. He just looked at his daughter with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was something in the neighborhood of shame, though on Roy Mercer it sat so awkwardly that she almost didn't recognize it. "Eliza," he said. "Papa," she said. The word came out neutral, which took effort. "I need to talk to you." "You're talking." He looked at the two men flanking her, then back at her. "Alone." "No," she said, simply, without apology. He absorbed this. His jaw moved. "I understand that. Yes." "All right." He looked down at the handkerchief on its stick, seemed to realize he was still holding it, and lowered it to his side. "I made a mistake." The silence that followed had a particular texture. Not disbelief, she believed he believed it, but the word mistake was doing a lot of work there, and she was going to make him do more of it himself. "What kind of mistake?" she said. "The auction." He swallowed. "What I did. What I let bench. What I—" He stopped. Tried again. "He told me it was a debt arrangement, that you'd work for him 6 months and the debt would be cleared. I didn't tell me what he didn't explain what he actually—" "Stop," Eliza said. He stopped. "Papa." She kept her voice even, though her hands at her sides were not. "You wrote my name on a bill of sale. You stood on a platform and described me to a crowd of men like you were selling a horse. You watched them bid." She paused. "You knew what that was. You knew in the moment what it was. What you didn't know was what Bench planned to do with it, and that's a different thing from not knowing what you were doing." Roy's face crumpled slightly at the edges. He looked old. He was 51, but he looked older than that, and she hated that this made any part of her feel anything other than the clean anger she'd been carrying. "You're right," he said. "That's right. I'm not here to tell you I didn't know. I'm here because—" He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Because Bench came to me last week. He told me what he was doing with the legal filings. He told me what he'd paid Oates, and he wanted me to sign another document, an affidavit saying the bill of sale was invalid, that I'd been coerced into signing it by Silas Boone." The porch was very quiet. "He wanted you to perjure yourself against me," Silas said. It was the first time he'd spoken. Roy looked at him. Something moved through Roy's face that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite fear. Something between the two. "Yes," he said. "He did." "And you said no," Eliza said. "I said no." He held out the envelope. "And then I took every document I still had from when he bought my debt note, the original agreement, the correspondence, the terms he laid out, and I put them in that envelope. Because if you're going to fight him, you should have everything." He paused. "It's not enough. I know it's not enough. Not for what I did, but it's what I have." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Silas came down the porch steps and crossed the 20 feet between the porch and Roy Mercer, and took the envelope from his hand. He didn't say anything. He looked at Roy for a moment with the flat, measuring look he used when he was deciding something, and then he turned and came back to the porch. Eliza looked at her father. This was the moment she had imagined, in various forms, for years. The moment where Roy Mercer finally arrived with something that looked like accountability. She had always assumed that when this moment came, she would feel one specific thing, triumph, or grief, or the particular cold satisfaction of being vindicated. What she actually felt was tired. Deeply, specifically tired. The way you get tired not from a single hard day, but from a long accumulation of them. "You should come inside," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten." Roy blinked. "Eliza? I'm not forgiving you," she said. "I want that to be clear. I'm offering you food because you're a person and you walked a long way, and because I need to know everything you know about Bench's arrangement, and I'd rather have that conversation at a table than on a porch." She turned and went back through the door. "Come in or don't. That's your choice." She heard his footsteps on the porch steps behind her. "What?" Garrett stayed outside, which was a kindness to everyone. Silas sat at the table with his coffee and the envelope open in front of him, reading while Eliza put food on the stove. Roy sat across from Silas and did not speak until spoken to, which was new and strange and also something of a relief. The documents in the envelope were more than Eliza had expected. Roy had kept everything, the original debt note, the terms of the arrangement Bench had proposed, 3 letters in Bench's handwriting outlining the plan for the auction,
and most significantly, a ledger page that showed the payments made to 4 men in Red Hollow who had been the arranged bidders. Silas read through all of it twice. Then he said, "Did you know when you signed the debt note what the collection mechanism was?" "He told me the collection would be in labor," Roy said. "He said Eliza would work at one of his operations for 6 months. That's what he told me." "And you believe that?" Roy looked at the table. "I wanted to believe it. That's different." Silas looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." Eliza set a plate in front of her father without ceremony. He looked at it, and then he looked at her, and she saw his throat move. "Thank you," he said. She sat down with her own coffee. She was not going to eat. Her stomach was not cooperating, but she needed something to do with her hands. "Tell me about the men who were arranged, the bidders. Do you know their names?" Roy ate while he talked, which she didn't comment on because he genuinely looked like he hadn't eaten in 2 days. He named 3 of the 4 men. Garrett, when she called him in to hear this, recognized 2 of them immediately. One was the same man Daisy Crum had seen talking to Roy through the feed store wall. "Crum heard his name," Garrett said, looking at Roy. "She can identify him." Roy nodded. "Vernon Cade. He's been Bench's man in Red Hollow for about a year. Works at the livery as cover." "Will Cade talk?" Silas asked. "Not voluntarily, but if he thinks he's going federal—" Roy stopped. "He's got a family in Kansas. He's not the type to go down for someone else's scheme." Garrett and Silas exchanged a look that Eliza recognized as the look of men who have just received a piece of information they know how to use. "I'll find him," Garrett said. After supper, after Roy had eaten and drunk 2 cups of coffee and the color had come back into his face somewhat, Silas took the documents and went to the front room to write to Aldrich. Garrett went to prepare the spare bunkhouse cot, because there was no question of Roy riding back down the trail in the dark in his condition, which left Eliza and her father alone in the kitchen for the first time. She had not planned for this. She had thought, going into the evening, that she could manage the whole thing with other people present, could keep it functional and practical, and spare herself the part where it became something more complicated. But here was her father at her kitchen table with his hands around an empty coffee cup, and here she was across from him, and there was nobody else. Roy looked at the window, then he looked at his hands, then he said, "Your mother would be ashamed of me." Her mother had been dead 12 years. Eliza had stopped talking about her to Roy a long time ago because Roy always made her mother's memory about himself somehow, his grief, his loss, what her death had done to him. She had resented this for years. But sitting here now, she thought that maybe, just possibly, he wasn't doing that this time. Maybe he was just saying a true thing. "Yes," Eliza said. "She would." He nodded, like he'd expected this and needed to hear it anyway. "I know you're not forgiving me." "No. I'm not asking you to." He turned the cup in his hands. "I just want you to know that I understand what I did. Not what I told myself I was doing, what I actually did." He looked at her. "I sold my daughter. I told myself a story about it, but that's what I did." She held his gaze. "Yes, that's what you did. And the man who bought you," he glanced toward the front room, toward Silas, "he's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who wanted what Bench wanted, something for himself." Roy paused. "He looked at you out there on the porch, and I watched his face. That's not a man who thinks he owns you." Eliza said nothing. "I did a terrible thing," Roy said, "and it turned out, by accident, not by anything good in me, you ended up somewhere decent." He looked down. "That doesn't make it right. I know that. But it's the only thing I can hold on to right now." She thought about telling him that the outcome being decent did not retroactively redeem the intention, which was true. She thought about telling him that she had stood on a platform in September and heard men put prices on her while he stood to the side and smiled, which was also true. She thought about the shaking in her hands that had taken a mile of riding to work out, and the brass key in her pocket, and 3 months of mornings at the east window putting herself back together piece by piece. She thought about all of it, and she looked at her father and she said, You should sleep." Garrett set up the bunkhouse. He stood up from the table slowly, the way a man does when his joints have been telling him things he's been ignoring. He picked up his coat. He went to the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame, not looking at her. "Eliza." "What?" "I'm sorry." He said it to the door frame. flat with no performance. Just the two words, said like a man who knows they're not enough and says them anyway because they're what he has. She didn't answer. He went out. She sat in the kitchen alone for a long time after that, with her hands around her own cold coffee cup and the lamp burning low and the sound of the wind in the pines. And she let herself feel all of it, the anger and the grief and the strange sad pity and the exhaustion. She let it all be there at once without pushing any of it down. And after a while it settled into something quieter that didn't have a name. And she got up and put out the lamp and went to her room and turned the key in the lock and lay down in the dark and stared at the ceiling until she slept. Aldrich arrived 4 days later, riding up from Benton with a younger associate named Park, who carried the files and said almost nothing but appeared to understand everything. Aldrich himself was a compact, silver-haired man of 60, with the manner of someone who had been in difficult rooms for 40 years and had developed a particular economy of expression as a result. He said what mattered and not much else, which meant he and Silas got along efficiently. He spread the documents on the kitchen table, the notarized declaration, the bill of sale, Roy's envelope, Daisy Crumb's written statement, Fisk's affidavit, and 3 pages of notes from Agnes Holloway regarding Margaret Sills's account of the document irregularities. He read through everything twice. Park handed him papers in the right order without being asked. Then Aldrich looked up and said, "We have enough to challenge the hearing." The room went still with relief. Eliza felt it in her own chest. Not the full release of it, because this wasn't over, but the first deep breath after a long time of shallow ones. "Tell me what enough looks like," Silas said. "The letters in Roy Mercer's envelope are the center of it," Aldrich said. Bench put the auction arrangement in writing, 3 letters. That's either arrogance or sloppiness, probably both, given that he assumed Roy was fully controlled and would never hand them over. He tapped the letters. This establishes that the auction was fraudulent from inception. A fraudulent auction cannot produce a legally binding bill of sale, which means the bill of sale Bench is claiming supersedes your notarized document doesn't exist in any meaningful legal sense, because the transaction itself was invalid. "What about Oates?" Garrett said. Aldrich's expression moved into something dry and careful. "Judge Oates received a copy of Margaret Sill's documentation this morning by messenger before I left Benton." He paused. "Miss Sills kept meticulous records of 2 previous Bench transactions that Oates ruled on. The records show significant discrepancies between what was filed with the court and what was actually executed." He folded his hands. "Judge Oates is a man who has been compromised. He is also a man who does not want to be publicly known as a compromised man. I expect we will receive a notice of recusal within the week." Silas looked at him. "You sent that before you knew he'd recuse." "I sent it because I knew he'd recuse," Aldrich said simply. "A man with that much to lose does not gamble on whether the evidence exists. He recuses himself and claims a scheduling conflict." "And the new judge?" "Circuit judge named Harmon. I've appeared before her 4 times. She is thorough, and she does not like fraudulent debt schemes." Aldrich allowed himself a brief, minimal expression that in another man might have been a smile. "We are in a better position than we were." Eliza had been listening all of this from her seat at the end of the table. She had been watching Aldrich, watching Silas, watching Park silently arranging papers. Now she said, "What do we need from me?" "For the hearing." Aldrich looked at her with the attentive, unsentimental gaze of a professional. "Your testimony. About the auction. What you saw. What was said. What your father told you." He paused. "It will not be comfortable. Bench's lawyers will question you directly. They'll attempt to—" "I know what they'll attempt," she said. "I've been managing difficult men since I was 8 years old. I'll be fine." Aldrich studied her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I believe you will." Roy testified to Aldrich that afternoon in the front room with the door closed, and Eliza stayed in the kitchen and did not try to hear through the wall, though she could hear the low rhythm of voices, question, answer, question, for nearly 2 hours. When it was over, Roy came through the kitchen on his way out without looking at her, and Aldrich came through a minute later and said quietly, "He told us everything. He didn't minimize." "Good," Eliza said. "That surprised me," Aldrich said. "Men in his position usually minimize." "He didn't have anything left to protect," she said. "That's the only time my father ever tells the truth, when he's got nothing left." Aldrich looked at her with something that was not pity. She would have noticed pity, and said, "The hearing is in 11 days.
I'll send word if anything changes before then.
The day before the hearing, Bench made his last move. Eliza was out at the corral when she heard the horse coming up the trail fast. Not the measured pace of Petworth's visit, but fast, someone pushing hard. She moved toward the barn out of instinct, which Silas had once told her was good instinct. Never stand in the open when you don't know what's coming. It was not Bench's men. It was Vernon Cade. He rode in alone, which was remarkable enough. But more remarkable was the state he was in. Hat gone, coat open, the look of a man who had made a very fast decision and was still running on the adrenaline of it. He pulled up hard when he saw Garrett coming out of the barn and nearly fell getting off his horse. "I need Aldrich," he said, breathing hard. "I need to talk to Aldrich before tomorrow." Garrett looked at him with no expression. "You're Cade." "Yes. I know who I am. I need—" "Bench knows I've been talking to people. He sent 2 men to my room this morning. I got out the back." He looked at Garrett with red-rimmed eyes. "I've got names. I've got the name of every man he paid in that auction. I've got dates and amounts. I'll put it all on paper. I'll testify in person." He swallowed. "But I need protection first. I need to know that if I walk into that hearing tomorrow, Bench can't—" Silas had come out of the house. He stood on the porch and looked at Cade with the kind of look that takes a long time to form. "Get him inside," he said to Garrett, "and send a rider to Benton tonight." Eliza watched Cade walk past her toward the house, shaking and disheveled and entirely unlike the arranged bidder she'd imagined. Just a frightened man who'd made bad choices and had reached the point where the bad choices were about to cost more than the alternatives. She understood that feeling in a different way. She understood it very well. She went inside after them. Whoa. The morning of the hearing broke cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that felt like an argument against everything difficult, too blue, too bright, too calm for what it was. They rode to Benton in a group, Silas and Eliza, Garrett, Aldrich and Park, Roy Mercer on a borrowed horse, and Cade with Garrett's hand close enough to reach if he decided to reconsider. Agnes Holloway had ridden in the night before and was already at the courthouse when they arrived. She'd brought Clive, and she'd brought Daisy Crumb, who was small and neat, and had a face that said she would say exactly what she'd seen and not one word more or less. The courthouse in Benton was a square stone building that smelled like paper and age. Circuit Judge Harmon was already on the bench when they filed into the room, a woman of 55 with gray streaks and dark hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head when she wasn't using them, which she deployed with a precision that seemed designed to let people know when she was reading something carefully versus when she was listening. Bench was there. Eliza had not expected to feel much at the sight of him, or had told herself she wouldn't. But seeing him across the room, tall, pale-eyed, in his careful clothes, with Petworth beside him and 2 other lawyers arranged behind, she felt the particular animal response that her body had apparently stored from the auction, the slow cold that moved through her chest and had to be consciously, deliberately overridden. He looked at her once. His expression was composed. She met his eyes and held them until he looked away first, and that at least felt like something. The hearing went for 4 hours. Aldrich was exact and unhurried, the way a man is when he knows his material completely and doesn't need to perform confidence because he has the real thing. He laid out the evidence in sequence: the fraudulent auction established by Bench's own letters, the arranged bidders confirmed by Cade's testimony and Daisy Crumb's account, the prior notarized document establishing Eliza's legal freedom before the auction took place, and Margaret Sills's documentation of the pattern of legal manipulation in Bench's previous dealings. Petworth objected frequently. Judge Harmon overruled him frequently. She did this with the minimal expression of a woman who has heard every version of these objections before and is not impressed by any of them. Roy testified. He sat in the witness chair and answered every question without flinching, and when Petworth cross-examined him and suggested he was acting out of personal interest, Roy said, "My personal interest would be to say nothing. I'm here because what I did was wrong, and I'm trying—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I'm trying to do one thing right." Cade testified. He was visibly frightened and visibly determined, which was an interesting combination to watch. He named names. He cited dates. He produced from his coat pocket a folded paper on which Bench's representative had written the amounts paid to each arranged bidder in the Red Hollow auction, which he had kept, apparently, as insurance and was now deploying as testimony. Petworth attempted to have the paper excluded. Judge Harmon looked at it over her reading glasses, declared it relevant, and placed it into evidence.
Then Eliza took the witness chair. She had thought about this moment for 11 days.
She had rehearsed nothing specifically because Aldrich had told her that rehearsed testimony sounded rehearsed, and Judge Harmon would notice. What he had said instead was, tell what you saw, tell what you heard, tell what was done to you, and tell it straight. She told it straight. She told it from the moment Roy had shoved the bill of sale across the table and told her the auction started at noon. She told it through the platform, and the bidding, and Benedict Cross's pale measuring look. She told it through Silas arriving and the ride north and the documents in the envelope that said void, free. She told it quietly and precisely, and when Petworth rose to cross-examine her and began with, Miss Mercer, isn't it true that you were in significant debt yourself at the time of the auction? She said, I was not in debt. My father was in debt. In a tone that stopped him briefly in his tracks. He tried 4 more angles. She answered each of them with the same directness. She did not get flustered. She did not get loud. She looked at Petworth when he spoke to her, and she answered his questions like a woman who has nothing to hide and knows it, and wants him to know she knows it. When it was done and she came back to the table, Silas put his hand over hers briefly, just for a moment, just a touch, and then removed it. She looked straight ahead. Judge Harmon deliberated for 40 minutes. Then she came back to the bench, put on her reading glasses, and read her ruling into the record. The auction of September the 4th was declared fraudulent and void in its entirety. The bill of sale executed that day was declared legally null. The notarized declaration of Eliza Ann Mercer's freedom, predating the auction by 3 days, was declared valid and binding. All claims by Elias Bench against the person or legal status of Eliza Ann Mercer were dismissed. Then Judge Harmon looked at Petworth over her reading glasses and said, I am also referring the documentation regarding Mr. Bench's previous dealings with this court to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for review. I expect that office will be in contact. She removed her glasses. This hearing is concluded. Bench did not look at Eliza when he left. He walked out with Petworth and his lawyers in a tight, fast group, and she watched him go and felt, not triumph exactly, not the clean satisfaction she'd imagined, more like the feeling of putting down something very heavy that you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten the weight of it. She became aware of the room around her, Agnes, who was gripping Clive's arm and looking at Eliza with bright eyes, Garrett, who was standing with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has watched something go exactly the way it should, Daisy Crumb, who nodded at Eliza once with the precise satisfaction of a woman whose testimony had been used for the right thing. Roy Mercer was near the door, not with the group, standing slightly apart, his hat in his hands. He looked at Eliza across the room. She looked at him. She did not go to him. He did not come to her. But something passed between them that she didn't have a word for, not reconciliation, not forgiveness, not the restoration of anything. Just the acknowledgement of 2 people who would always be what they were to each other, changed permanently by what had happened, and proceeding from here. He put on his hat and went out. Aldrich appeared beside her. Congratulations, Miss Mercer. As of this ruling, you are a legally established free person in this territory. It's in the record. No one can challenge it. Thank you, she said. For all of it. He nodded. Thank your witnesses. They're the ones who walked in here and said what they saw. He picked up his leather case. I'll send you a copy of the ruling when it's transcribed. She turned from him and found Silas standing beside her. He was looking at her in the way he had of looking at things, steady, without agenda, simply taking in what was there. He looked like he wanted to say something and was selecting the right version of it. Let's go home, he said. It was the simplest sentence she had heard all day, and it was the one that got through her composure in a way that 4 hours of legal proceedings had not. Yes, she said, and she meant it entirely. Let's go home. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold, clear afternoon, and the mountains were visible to the north, and somewhere on the north ridge there was a ranch with a kitchen that faced east, and a corral full of horses and a brass key on a hook by the door, and it was hers in every way that counted. The ride back from Benton took most of the afternoon, and nobody talked much. That was all right. There are moments that don't need commentary, and this was one of them. Aldrich and Park had stayed in town to handle the paperwork that follows a ruling. Agnes and Clive had ridden ahead. Garrett kept a few lengths back, which Eliza understood was deliberate, his particular version of giving people space without abandoning them entirely. She rode beside Silas on the bay mare, the mountains getting larger ahead of them as they climbed back toward the North Ridge, and she thought about what the judge had said. Legally established free person. In the record. No one can challenge it. She had been a free person before the ruling, technically, by virtue of the notarized document. But there is a difference between having a piece of paper that says you are free and having a court ruling that says it in front of witnesses, and Eliza felt that difference in her body the way you feel a change in altitude. Not dramatic, just a fundamental shift in pressure. She had been holding herself braced for so long that she wasn't entirely sure how to stop. "You're thinking hard," Silas said. "I'm always thinking hard." "I know, this is a different kind." She glanced at him. He was watching the trail, not her, which was how he usually conducted the conversations that mattered. "I'm trying to figure out what comes next," she said. "What do you want to come next?" The question was direct enough that it surprised her slightly, which was becoming a pattern with him. Just when she thought she had his rhythms mapped, he'd do something outside them. She thought about the answer honestly rather than reflexively. "I want to plant the kitchen garden in spring," she said. "Agnes brought me those seed packets in October and I haven't done anything with them. The south side of the house gets good light. I looked at it when the snow was melting and there's a strip of ground that would work." She paused. "And I want to learn to ride properly, not survive on a horse. Actually ride." "You're already actually riding," he said. "I'm better than I was. I'm not good yet." He was quiet for a moment. "What else?" She understood that what else meant more than the garden and the riding, and she understood that he was asking her something specific under the general question, and she decided to answer the specific thing rather than the general one. "I want to stay," she said, not as an employee." The trail narrowed slightly, and they rode single file for a few strides and then widened again. A hawk went over them, the same kind of unhurried high-riding hawk she'd seen on that first day, or one just like it. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about a month," Silas said, "and I haven't managed it, so I'm going to say it imperfectly and ask you not to hold the imperfection against me." "All right." "I'm not good at—" He stopped. Tried again. "I've been alone for 4 years. After Ruth, I thought that was just how it was going to be, and after a while I stopped arguing with it. And then you came, and the house was different, and I was different, and I kept telling myself it was gratitude or proximity or something that would even out over time." He looked at her then, directly, which was not how he usually did things but was clearly necessary for this. "It didn't even out." She looked back at him. The afternoon light was going gold and long across the ridge. "I know I bought you," he said, and the words were careful and weighted. "I know what that means and what it looks like, and I know that no matter what I intended, that is a fact between us. I'm not asking you to set it aside. I need you to know that what I feel is—" He exhaled. "You're the first person in 4 years who's made this place feel like something worth coming back to at the end of the day. And I don't know how to say that without it sounding like less than it is." The bay mare moved beneath her steadily, her hooves on the rocky trail making their particular rhythm. "You know what I thought about at the hearing today?" Eliza said. "When I was sitting in that witness chair and Petworth was asking his questions?" "What?" "I thought about the lantern," she said. He looked at her. "The one you moved to the hook by the door," she said. "You never mentioned it. You just moved it. And I thought, a man who moves a lantern to a hook because someone suggested it makes sense and doesn't need to make a speech about it and doesn't need credit for it, that's a man I understand. That's a man I trust." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You thought about a lantern in the middle of a court hearing." "I think about a lot of things at inconvenient times." "Apparently." She almost smiled. "Silas?" "Yeah." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I mean that the way it sounds. I'm not going to Benton. I'm not going to Harlow Springs. I'm staying on the North Ridge, and I would like to do that as your partner rather than your employee. And I would like us to be clear about what that means before either of us says anything else about it." He pulled his horse to a stop. She stopped beside him. "What does it mean to you?" he said. She thought about how to say it exactly. "It means I'm here because I want to be, not because I don't have anywhere else, not because you were kind to me when I needed it, though you were, and I won't forget it, because I want this, the ranch, the work, the life on this ridge. And you." She said the last 2 words plainly, without decoration. "I want you in it, as an equal." He looked at her for a long moment in the gold afternoon light, with the mountains behind him, and the hawk long gone, and the trail stretching ahead toward home. "That's the best thing anyone said to me in 4 years," he said. "I thought you might like it." "I'd like to—" He stopped. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that no is an answer I'll accept. Not gracefully, maybe, but I'll accept it." "Ask," she said. He asked. It was not elaborate. He was not an elaborate man. He said that he would like, if she was willing, to make the partnership she described legal and permanent, to take whatever time she needed and do it properly, with Aldrich drawing up fair and equal terms, and then to marry her in whatever way she wanted and spend the rest of his life treating her the way she should always have been treated. She had expected when this moment came, because she had known for some weeks that this moment was coming, to feel some version of the fear that had governed most of her life. The instinct to qualify, to hedge, to preserve an exit. She waited for it. It didn't come. What came instead was simple and clear and felt like the sensation of stepping out of a cold room into warmth that you'd forgotten existed. "Yes," she said, "with equal terms." "Equal terms," he agreed. "Aldrich will enjoy writing them." "He'll enjoy it enormously," she said. "He's going to write them very carefully." "Good." Silas looked at her, and what was on his face was not triumph or possession, or even the straightforward happiness she might have expected. It was something quieter, something that looked, she thought, like a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. "Good," he said again, more quietly. Garrett's voice came from behind them, where he'd stopped a respectful distance back. "Are we going home, or are we having a meeting in the middle of the trail?" "We're going home," Eliza called back. "Excellent," Garrett said, and she could hear without looking that he was smiling. "Why?" They were married in April, when the snow had pulled back to the highest elevations, and the south strip beside the house was soft enough to turn for the garden. Aldrich had indeed enjoyed writing the terms: equal partnership in the property, equal voice in decisions, provisions for Eliza's independent legal standing that he said were more detailed than any marriage contract he'd drawn in 40 years, and which he said with an expression that suggested he thought more of them should be. The ceremony was small. Agnes and Clive Holloway. Garrett, who wore his good coat and had gotten a haircut, which Eliza suspected had cost him more personal effort than any of the fence mending and roof patching he'd done all winter. Daisy Crumb came up from Red Hollow because Agnes had invited her and she'd said yes immediately, which said something about Daisy Crumb's character that Eliza would remember later when it mattered. The Farrow family sent a letter, Daniel and Clara and their daughter Elizabeth, who was 7 months old and reportedly loud and healthy and opinionated, all of which her name implied. There was no one from Eliza's family. Roy Mercer had left Benton 3 days after the hearing and sent a single letter from somewhere in Nevada that said he'd found work and was trying to stay out of card games. She had read it twice and put it away, and not written back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She hadn't decided, and she was allowing herself the space of not deciding. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office, as Judge Harmon had promised, was in contact with Elias Bench. Aldrich sent word in February that Bench had been charged with 3 counts of fraudulent debt manipulation and 1 count of conspiracy to circumvent territorial law. The charges were serious. The evidence, including everything from Roy's envelope and Margaret Sills's records, was described as substantial. Bench had lawyers, as men like Bench always had lawyers, and the process would be long, but Aldrich said with his minimal, precise expression that he did not expect it to resolve in Bench's favor. This was enough. It was not everything. Men like Bench sometimes found ways around things that should stop them, but it was enough to sleep on, and Eliza had learned in the practical way of a woman who has spent too much time lying awake, worrying about things that haven't happened yet, that enough to sleep on was a form of wealth. She planted the kitchen garden in the 3rd week of April, 2 weeks after the wedding, on a morning when the light was exactly right, and the ground smelled like cold water and new growth. She put in tomatoes and beans and squash and 2 rows of sunflowers that she planted, she admitted to herself, because she wanted them rather than because they were practical, which was a small private act of extravagance that she was still learning to allow herself. Silas came out while she was on her knees in the dirt and crouched beside her and looked at the rows. "Sunflowers," he said. "They'll be tall by August," she said. "They'll face the south. I like them." He looked at her on her knees in the April soil and said nothing for a moment. Then, I found something in the barn this morning, in the loft, in a box. She looked up. What kind of something? Books. Ruth's books. I'd forgotten they were up there. I was going to, He stopped. There are about 30 of them. Some of them are primers. Reading books. She sat back on her heels. Primers. She used to talk about teaching, he said. She'd mentioned doing something, a school or something like it, for the children on the neighboring claims. She never had the chance to... He paused. I don't know if you'd want... Yes, Eliza said. He blinked. I haven't finished explaining. You don't need to. She was already thinking. The north room of the house, the one that faced the mountain, which had been used for storage since she arrived. The Holloway boy Thomas, who was 16 and could ride, who could serve as a messenger. The 3 families she knew of within a 10-mile stretch of the ridge who had children old enough to learn to read and no school within 40 miles. She had been a good student herself once, before Roy had decided her education was an unnecessary expense. She had been a very good student. The north room, she said. If we clear it out and put in a proper table. I was thinking the same thing, Silas said. She looked at him. She would have been good at it, she said. Ruth. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, she would have. This was the first time they had spoken Ruth's name out loud between them, not with awkwardness, not with the careful avoidance that had governed their first months, but plainly the way you say the name of someone who was real and mattered and left a mark on the world they occupied. Eliza had thought she might feel strange about it. She didn't. She felt instead something that was close to gratitude, for a woman she had never met who had kept books in a loft and dreamed about teaching children on a mountain ridge, and whose dream had survived her by 4 years and landed here, in a kitchen garden in April, between 2 people who had found each other in the most improbable of ways. I'll start on the north room this week, she said. I'll help, he said. You'll be busy with the cattle. I'll still help. He stood up and brushed off his knees. I'm going to bring the books down from the loft this afternoon. You should look through them, figure out what's there. She turned back to her sunflowers. Silas. Yeah. Thank you for telling me. It's your house too, he said, which was the same thing she had once said to Garrett about the shelf, and she understood that he meant it the same way she had, not as a legal fact, but as something deeper and less formal than that. He went back toward the barn, and she went back to her planting, and the morning moved over the ridge in its slow way, and the sunflower seeds went into the dark soil in 2 straight rows. And none of this was the life she had imagined for herself at 20, standing behind grain sacks in a feed store trying not to cry. It was better. Not easier. It was not and would not be an easy life, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. The winters on the North Ridge were brutal. The cattle work was constant. The ranch finances required careful attention that neither of them could afford to stop paying. There would be arguments. There had already been 2 significant ones, once about money and once about a fence line dispute with a neighbor to the west that had gone on longer than it needed to because both she and Silas were, in their different ways, stubborn. They had resolved both arguments imperfectly, the way real arguments get resolved, not with one person winning and one losing, but with both of them tired and slightly dissatisfied and willing to move forward anyway, which was, she had decided, what working partnership actually looked like when you stripped away the romantic version of it. But it was hers. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not because a man had given it to her, and not because a court had declared it, but because she had chosen it with a clear head and both eyes open, and that made all the difference between a life that happens to you and a life that you actually live. The school opened in September, 1 year to the month after the auction in Red Hollow. She had not planned this symmetry. It happened because that was when she was ready, and when the North Room was done, and when she had sent word to enough families to have 7 children committed to coming. The date had presented itself, and she had accepted it without ceremony, and it was only when Agnes pointed it out, standing in the doorway of the North Room, looking at the table and the benches and the borrowed books arranged along the windowsill, that Eliza had let herself feel what that meant. "A year ago today," Agnes said. "I know." Agnes looked at her with her sharp dark eyes. "How does that feel?" Eliza looked at the room. The north window faced the mountain, and in the September morning, the mountain was doing that thing it did in early fall.
the high slopes catching the light in a way that made them look close enough to touch.
She had stood at this window a dozen times in the months of clearing and cleaning and preparing, and every time she had thought about Ruth Boone standing in this same spot and thinking about children and books and the particular ambition of wanting to offer something to people who didn't have it. "It feels," she said, and paused, looking for the right word. "Earned. It feels earned." Agnes nodded as if this was exactly right. The 7 children arrived on horseback or on foot or in their parents' wagons, ranging in age from 6 to 14, in various states of preparation, some of them visibly dubious and at least one of them visibly terrified, which Eliza recognized because she had felt it herself in different circumstances, and knew that the terror would ease once something became familiar. She greeted each of them by name at the door because she had learned all their names already, and she had learned them deliberately, the way you do when you understand that knowing a person's name is the first signal of whether you plan to take them seriously. She started with reading, because reading was the door that opened everything else. She had 7 different skill levels in the room, and she dealt with this the way she dealt with most practical problems, by being organized about it and not pretending the challenge didn't exist. The older children helped the younger ones. She had not asked them to do this. She had simply arranged the seating so that an older child was beside each younger one, and the help had happened naturally because children are generally more decent than adults give them credit for. By noon, the terror had lifted from the youngest one, a girl named Bess, 6 years old, with mud on her boots and her older brother's too large coat, and she was sounding out words from the primer with a concentration so fierce it was almost frightening. Eliza stood at the front of the room and watched them, and felt something so straightforward and complete that she almost didn't trust it. She had spent so much of her life managing fear and anger and the constant vigilance of living in proximity to danger that simple satisfaction felt foreign, felt like something that needed checking. She let herself have it anyway. Garrett left the following spring. Not in anger. He had simply been offered something he'd wanted for a long time, a small piece of land of his own 20 miles west, an opportunity he'd been waiting on for 3 years, and that had finally come through. He told Silas first and then came to find Eliza in the kitchen, which she understood was its own kind of statement. "I want you to know," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, the same way Roy Mercer had stood in this doorway, though everything about the 2 men was different, that this place is better than when I came here, and that's mostly you. "It's all of us," she said. "Most of it's you," he said firmly, the way Garrett said things when he had decided they were true and didn't need argument. "The house, the school, the way Silas is—" He stopped. "He's different, better. He laughs more." She looked at her hands. "He does," she said. "I'm going to miss it here," he said. "I'm not going to say I'll be back often, because that's usually a thing people say and then don't do, but I'll be back sometimes." "You'd better be," she said, "or I'll tell Agnes and she'll go get you herself." He smiled, the full smile, the one that changed his whole face, and she thought about the first day, the first real conversation, him standing in this kitchen saying he'd been making a real mess of the housekeeping, and her saying she could see that from here, and the moment the air between them shifted from wariness to something functional, and then slowly into something like trust. She hugged him, which startled him, and then he returned it with the slightly awkward enthusiasm of a man who is not generally a hugger, but is willing to try. He left on a Tuesday morning in April, with his horse and his belongings and a jar of her preserved tomatoes that she had insisted on, and she stood on the porch and watched him go down the south trail until the trees took him, and then she stood there a little longer. Silas came and stood beside her. "Good man," he said. "The best kind," she said. They hired 2 ranch hands that summer, a young man named Cord who was 22 and had come from somewhere in Texas with good instincts and a tendency to talk too much, and a quiet woman in her 30s named Hale who had arrived in Red Hollow with a bruise on her jaw and a determination in her face that Eliza recognized instantly and specifically. She had spoken to Silas about Hale before hiring her, and Silas had said without hesitation, "If she can do the work, hire her." She could do the work. She was hired. Hale turned out to be extraordinary with horses, better than anyone Eliza had seen, and within 3 months she was managing the corral side of things in a way that freed Silas for the cattle range and generally improved the mood of every horse on the property. She didn't talk about where she'd come from. Nobody asked. She stayed, and eventually she stopped flinching when someone came into a room quickly, and Eliza noticed this without commenting on it, because some things you acknowledge by witnessing them quietly rather than by naming them out loud. The news about Elias Bench came in November of the second year in a letter from Aldrich. He had been convicted on 2 of the 3 charges: fraudulent debt manipulation and conspiracy. The third charge had been reduced as part of a legal negotiation that Aldrich described in the dry, factual tone of a man who had seen this kind of thing before and was not going to pretend the outcome was perfect when it was merely good. Bench was sentenced to 4 years and the forfeiture of assets connected to the fraudulent schemes, which amounted to a significant sum. Petworth had turned evidence against his client early in the process and received no charges, which Aldrich noted with the same dry expression he used for most things. Vernon Cade received immunity in exchange for testimony, as had been arranged. Roy Mercer, whose cooperation had been essential to establishing the fraudulent nature of the debt note, was named in the court record as a cooperative witness and faced no charges. Eliza read the letter at the kitchen table in the November morning light. Then she folded it and set it down. 4 years was not enough for what Bench had done, not just to her, but to the other people in those land disputes Aldrich had found. The people whose property had been taken through the same mechanisms. The people nobody had fought for because nobody had shown up with a notarized document and $250 cash. She knew this. 4 years was not justice in the complete sense of the word. It was, however, consequence. And consequence, the real kind, the kind that involves a courtroom and a sentence and a forfeiture of assets, was rarer than it should be for men who operated the way Bench operated. She held on to that. She wrote to Aldrich thanking him, and she put the letter away, and she went back to work. There is something she has learned in the years since the platform in Red Hollow. She has thought about it many times in many forms, late at night, or on horseback, or in the schoolroom with the mountain in the window and 7 children bent over their primers. And she has arrived at it from different directions, but it always comes out the same. Freedom is not a door you walk through once. She had thought it was. She had thought that the moment Silas handed her those papers in the saddle on the trail north, the moment she read void, free. In careful block letters, that would be it, the thing she'd been waiting for, the moment everything opened. And it was a moment. It mattered. She is not diminishing it. But the door is a door you have to keep choosing to walk through every day in the small and specific ways that actually constitute a life. The morning light at the east window, the seed packets from Agnes, the lantern on the hook, the word yes when she meant it, and the word no when she meant that. The testimony delivered straight in a courtroom because she had nothing to hide. The school opened on a September morning because a woman she'd never met had kept books in a loft and died before she could use them. Every one of those moments was a choice. And the accumulation of those choices was the only freedom that turned out to be real and lasting. Not the kind granted by a document, but the kind built day by day with your own hands and your own voice, and the particular stubborn decision to keep being the person you've decided to be, regardless of what other people think they're owed. She is 23 now. She has a husband who moves lanterns to hooks without announcing it. A foreman who talks too much and handles horses like they're old friends. A ranch hand who has stopped flinching. A school with 11 students this year, and a waiting list of 6, and Agnes Holloway's voice in the back of her head at all times saying something practical and correct. She is not who she was on the platform. She is also not entirely different. She has the same anger she's always had. She has learned not to push it down but to use it, which is a different relationship with it. She has the same stubbornness that made Cutter step aside in the feed store and made Petworth stop in his tracks on the witness stand. She has the same practical intelligence that looked at a filthy kitchen and knew where to start. What she has that she didn't have before is time. The patience that comes from being safe enough to wait, from not having to manage every immediate crisis before it consumes everything. The luxury of thinking about next spring's garden while this spring's is still growing. The ability to disagree with her husband about fence lines and still come back to the same table for supper. She has a room with a key. She keeps the key on the hook by the door now because she doesn't need it in her pocket anymore. On the morning of the 2nd September, 2 years to the day after she stood on the platform and heard men put prices on her, she woke before the alarm of the ranch's noise, before the horses and the cattle and Cord's cheerful voice starting up somewhere in the barn. She woke in the quiet, and she lay there for a moment in the east light coming through the window, and she listened to Silas breathing beside her, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about all of it, the whole of it, from the platform to this morning, and she felt something she could only describe as gratitude, not to any particular force or power, just gratitude in its plain form, directed at the fact of being alive and present, and here, in a life she had built from the ruins of a terrible morning, with people she had chosen and who had chosen her back. She got up quietly. She put on her clothes. She went down to the kitchen and started the stove and put the coffee on, and she stood at the east window and watched the light come up over the mountain. The mountain did what it always did. It was enormous and quiet and entirely itself, unchanged by anything that had happened below it, which was both humbling and, in a strange way, reassuring. The world was larger than any one person's terrible morning. It was larger than any auction block or forged document or pale-eyed man in a careful coat. It would still be here, doing what it did, long after all of them were gone. Silas appeared in the doorway behind her. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of his footsteps, which she could have identified in the dark. "Coffee's not ready," she said. "I know." He came and stood beside her at the window. He looked at the mountain. She looked at the mountain. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood there together in the east light while the coffee came up and the ranch began its noise and the mountain stayed exactly where it was, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was